Well, good evening, afternoon, morning, depending on where you're joining us from. I'd like to welcome you to another webinar with Olive Tree Counseling Center. I think most people are joined. It always takes a minute for the waiting room to filter in. We're really delighted you're joining us from wherever you are in the world right now. This is, I was just talking with Nick, our presenter tonight. It feels like a long time since we've done this live, so I appreciate you joining us back for this. Just a few housekeeping details before we get into the content of tonight. If you've joined us for a webinar before, I think you probably have heard that we record these for our website for resources for people later. So for that reason, we ask you to stay muted while you're on the call. You're welcome to turn your camera on if you'd like to. Be interactive that way. Occasionally that messes with somebody's bandwidth and we might ask people to turn cameras off, but you're welcome to start out that way if you'd like and look at each other a little bit more if you'd care to. There's also a chat function, obviously, so as we go, we interact. If you have questions for Nick or responses to his questions, ask that you send those to either myself or to Nick, who I will introduce in just a minute, and are happy to get questions or things throughout sent to me directly, and then we'll have a time for question and answer at the end. So you can respond to those in the chat to me. So maybe just as a little warm up, we'll take a minute. I'm curious about where you're joining us from today. Before I introduce Nick, I wonder if you would just pop in the chat where you are in the world, city, country, otherwise. What is happening in your corners of the world where you're coming in from? We've got Cameroon and Slovakia and Kenya and Texas, Armenia, Portland, Cyprus, Uganda, Illinois in the US, India, Tunisia, North Carolina and the East Coast of the US. So really, we're almost Russia. We've got people from all over the globe. So super glad you're joining us. We're really excited to have people from all over joining us tonight. All right, so enough housekeeping. Welcome to all of you. I'd like to start introducing you to Nick, our speaker today. So Nick is a counselor. Nick Steffen is a counselor at Olive Tree Counseling Center. So well known to us, obviously, and this is a topic that we've talked about many times before. And in fact, right before we joined the call, Nick and I were having a great discussion about mindfulness and what he hopes you walk away with. So I think everybody's in for quite an experience tonight and some really good information and thought-provoking content. Just a little bit of background on Nick, but I'll let him tell you more. He and his family have lived here in Antalya for 2.5 years. They came to Turkey in the very first year of COVID, so we're very, very brave to join us in the midst of that. He is a clinical and pastoral counselor, so has a great perspective both in not just Christian counseling, but as a pastoral counselor as well. Nick is a very deep thinker and one of the most curious, like genuinely curious people I've ever met. So when something comes out of his mouth, it's something he's thought about or is curious about or could follow in a conversation for hours and hours. So again, without any further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Nick to take us to where he will tonight, talking about mindfulness as a Christian.
I'm excited to do it, Lisa. Thank you. And I have to admit, that's definitely one of the kindest compliments you could offer. I really do love to learn and know there's all too much that I don't know. So as we go along, I really look forward to seeing if the audience has any questions, thoughts, concerns. And I think to start off with, I'm kind of curious for those on the call tonight. I'd be interested to learn, what is it you're looking for tonight? Where do you find yourself with this topic? Is it something that's absolutely new, or you've heard about it and don't know what to think about it? Or you perhaps even practice mindfulness regularly and are looking to deepen that in some way. So if you would just go ahead and type into the chat any questions or thoughts you might have expressing where you are right now.
You can send those to either Nick or I. All right, a few responses coming in. Somebody's used mindfulness with counseling clients before, but want to do it in a way that's more spiritually integrated. Somebody else wants ideas for how to talk about it with more conservative Christians in a way that doesn't feel quite as maybe jarring to them. Somebody else said they've heard about it, but haven't practiced mindfulness. Somebody else says it's something that they use regularly. Want to deepen the practice. Somebody else's life is so busy, feels they need to be more intentional to learn to be mindful and needs more tools. Yeah. Several people are really interested specifically in the aspect of how to make it more accessible to Christians, or the aspect of integrating it more with faith and Christianity specifically.
Yeah, I think that gives us a really good starting point. It sounds like people are coming from a variety of places, but are looking to understand this question a little bit more deeply. I explicitly chose the title to emphasize that we're not merely coming to mindfulness as something that we have a firm grasp on, that is already so part of Christian practice that we know exactly how to say it. You know, if we saw a title Christian prayer, we would have a very clear image in our mind of what we were looking for, what we were talking about. But Christian mindfulness would cause some confusion, I think, for some. We wouldn't know how to make sense of that and where to go with it. So I'm hoping that by the end of tonight, you all have a better sense of what this term means. I hope what it doesn't mean, and how we can relate it a little bit more deeply to our faith, to our walk, to our to the process through which we're trying to deepen our intimacy with our Lord. And so, to begin with, just as a kind of an initial set of questions, what is mindfulness, and does it actually help? Does it do anything? I think this question, what is it, it is apropos simply because people seem to use it in a variety of related, but not quite identical ways. And so I'm going to offer some suggestions or some ways that I have seen it described that seems to cohere together or fit together to some degree. And the first example of that is of thinking of mindfulness as an exercise. It's a workout. This is a way that we can grow our attention muscle. So when I work with young people in particular, I like to use this metaphor simply because it's a really simple one. It can be hard to pay attention sometimes. We are living in a world that seems to be fractured in so many different ways, not least of which is our attention. Many of us will have screens in front of us right now, of course, and those screens at any moment will make noises, will bring up notifications, drawing our attention away. We find ourselves kind of split between the many demands of everything from our connections to work or friends or family or local community. There's so many demands, it can be hard to know where to go. So mindfulness, this first definition we're going to use, is that of an attention exercise. It exercises our ability to maintain our attention in a clear, direct way. We want to be present. And this idea of presence is one we'll come back to repeatedly. Secondly, it is the quality of our awareness. It is a state of self-awareness. So it's not just the exercise we perform, but it is the state that we find ourselves in when we are paying attention, in particular to our sensations, and mental activities. I find this is one of the more common definitions that I'll see. That mindfulness is a state of self-awareness. Thirdly, it is the quality of that awareness, or in other words, the way we pay attention, not just the fact that we're paying attention or the state that we get into, it's the fact that we can do it in a non-judgmental way. And I think what I would emphasize here, this sense of non-judgmental, the goal is really to say that we aren't getting stuck or attached in a particular way. One example I saw from a neurobiologist was, if we imagine stubbing our toe, at that moment after we've stubbed our toe, if immediately my mind turns to, "Oh, I can't believe I stubbed my toe. You know, what an idiot, man. I can't do anything. Now I'm gonna have to, worry about this." And at that moment, my mind is actually increasing the amount of distress I'm in. It's making things worse. Uh, so when we describe a non-judgmental attention, we're really talking about looking to leave an open hand to what we receive from our sensations, what we receive from our mental activities, relationships, etc. So this stance, this attitude that we bring to ourselves is a key element. And we're going to come back to that a little bit later. Fourthly, mindfulness exercises are themselves religious practices designed to help us accept reality as it is without getting stuck or lost in it. So often we can find ourselves getting stuck in certain thoughts, maybe, for example, ruminating thoughts, where we find ourselves thinking the same thing over and over. When we are in those places, mindfulness can be a way to help us draw back and recognize that we are more than our thoughts. We are not only our thoughts. We don't have to be stuck in them. Mindfulness is also, and the prior definition was perhaps a little bit more implying a spiritual context. This definition, the middle path between our emotions and our thoughts, comes from a clinical psychologist who was the founder of dialectical behavioral therapy. And we'll find I'm drawing these different definitions from a variety of different places, just to recognize that while there are a number of different approaches to it, they aren't necessarily purely identical. And so for this psychologist, mindfulness really expresses the middle path between our emotions and our thoughts, that we can find room to honor both our emotions and our thoughts and integrate them together into a wiser mind. One of my favorite definitions comes from Dan Siegel, who describes mindfulness as the way we befriend ourselves, the way we bring a sense of curiosity, openness, acceptance, and love to our own experience, to our sensations, mental activities, relationships. I capitalize those letters precisely because Dr. Siegel loves acronyms, and one of the ones that he often brings out is COAL, C-O-A-L, to remind us that we need to approach ourselves with this, with this stance. And for what it's worth, this is one area where I will often connect this approach, this COAL approach, to a more godly and kind approach. For those who read last month's newsletter, it is close. It can seem very closely related and even overlap with the self-compassion approach that our own psychologist here, Steve Scruggs, talked about there. And I would for those interested in looking for ways to integrate mindfulness in a fuller way, I would definitely encourage you to go back and take a look at that. The next definition is going to be the one that I often use with my clients, recognizing that it is our goal, our desire to love God with all of who we are, not just with part of it. Mindfulness is our being more fully and honestly present to ourselves, others, and to God. And recognizing this span of definitions, I hope it gives a little bit better sense of what we mean by mindfulness. Mindfulness is the way we pay attention to our paying attention. It's the way we become aware of our awareness, which can sound very paradoxical and challenging. So I hope that this list of bullet points gives some suggestions for what mindfulness is. But I do want to really emphasize this last point, which I feel is highly valuable for, especially for counselors or therapists working with clients. Mindfulness is not mindlessness. Sometimes when clients come in and need help working through their symptoms, we might use mindfulness with them. And for some, they might find a lot of value, a lot of comfort in the idea that they can disconnect from their emotions. They can disconnect from their thoughts. That is not mindfulness. That can be perfectly valuable and good. A lack of focused awareness, or essentially what I think of as downtime, is incredibly valuable and healthy for our minds. It's not a bad thing by any means, but it's not the same thing. Whereas mindlessness is tuning out, mindfulness is tuning in. But another key element is that mindfulness also is trying to avoid over-identifying with the experience. We are more than our thoughts. We are more than our feelings. Now, as easy as this is to say, it's hard in the moment. When we get angry, it can feel like the world is on fire. And there is nothing else but that anger. In fact, the more stressed we get, typically the more narrow our vision becomes, and we become hyper focused on a singular thing. We are more than this. We are never less than those thoughts or feelings, experiences, but we are always more. And this is, I think, a helpful principle that we'll come back to later, but I think it can give us a good place to begin. The next question, does mindfulness actually help? I saw an article in The Guardian suggesting that mindfulness has kind of become a cottage industry between self-help gurus, mental health caregivers, all the way to I've seen business management programs using it as well. I think I saw that even institutions as big as the U.S. Army and Google have offered mindfulness-oriented seminars and training to their workers, to their to people in their organization, precisely to help them manage the stressors of their work more effectively. So there's definitely a lot of people who thinks it does, and I'd like to focus in just for a moment on some of the value for us as therapists. How is it helpful for our clients? Notably, we recognize that mindfulness has been demonstrated to reduce the symptoms of anxiety and depression. It reduces rumination and worry. It correlates with overall psychological health that even goes outside of any particular mental disorder. People who practice mindfulness regularly find themselves more freely able to engage in the world. They find themselves less lost in their emotions, better able to communicate them, better able to just be present, both for uh, people around them, but even for themselves. Uh, Physically, it has been shown to reduce cortisol, which is our dominant stress hormone. It improves immune function. It improves heart health, and may even contribute to slowing the aging process. There really are a vast number of ways that mindfulness has been shown to be valuable. That doesn't make it a one-stop shop, a silver bullet for every problem out there. I've one old cliche that comes to mind is that if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. I think for some therapists, even it can be all too enticing to think mindfulness for every single problem out there. And we'll talk in a little bit about some reasons why you might not want to do that. But for the moment, I do think it's valuable to recognize the clinical benefit of mindfulness. Something that I've offered a quotation below from Daniel Siegel, who notes that the kind of the primary locus of the clinical benefit is our ability to accept our situation, can alleviate the internal battle that emerges when expectations of how life should be doesn't match how life is. I liked this image precisely because I find and have found with many of my clients that they're struggling with this sharp either or. They're struggling with this sharp sense that their life is not as it should be, and they're feeling lost in that. They don't know how to get where they want to go. And while and coming to us, especially as Christians, I try to emphasize this sense that when we have a vision of how we should be, we often imply that God loves us only when we are who we should be, that God is not loving or present for who we are right now. While we would not consciously believe it, I think sometimes that's precisely why this tension between life should be and life is comes to the fore, why it really can take center stage. And so this is one of the ways that mindfulness can really provide a lot of benefit. It can help us to be more present to life as it is and bring that honestly before God, rather than getting lost in thoughts and feelings about how life should be. Before moving on, I do want to emphasize that mindfulness as a theory is still just a theory. One of the largest attempts to utilize it in schools in the UK presented it to many teens. I think it was age 11 to 14 or so. It was a very significant study. They really put a lot of energy and funds into it. And ironically enough, what they found was that because they asked teachers to teach mindfulness to students, and the teachers themselves weren't experts in it, teaching people about mindfulness does not actually make them more mindful. It does not actually make them feel any better. And so all of the benefits we're talking about do not come from what we know about mindfulness. It comes from the practice thereof. And while this is probably incredibly obvious, I think it can be an easy distraction to fall into. And so, in trying to describe what mindfulness is, I felt like a good place to begin was with an exercise. And so, right now, wherever you're at, if you can safely do so, take a step back, sit down, Find a comfortable position. And I'd like you to notice your breath. We don't have to make ourselves breathe. We don't have to instruct ourselves how to do it. We can rest in our body breathing as God intended. So as you sit, I'd like you to allow your breath to come in through your nose and sense your diaphragm expand. And for this exercise, notice the sensations of your breath, the movement of your body. If you get distracted, that's okay. That's precisely what happens. Just rest in that, recognize the distraction, and return your attention. Okay, we'll go ahead and bring this practice to a close. Mindful breathing is mindfulness. It is a mindfulness practice that we can do at any moment, at any time. Mindfulness itself is not about getting some special book of mindfulness practices or uttering the right words. It's simply about being present with yourself. So I'd like to offer you my own personal experience just for a moment of when I have found this helpful in the past. 2020, as we all experienced, was a tremendously, uh, yeah, fracturing time in many ways. It broke us down, and many people found themselves more lost and unmoored. I myself had just left behind my prior job, but hadn't yet started here at Olive Tree. In fact, Amber had Amber, my wife, and I, we were set to come here the week before all the flights to the country shut down, and so we had come so close, and then didn't know where we were going next. Very kindly, my family opened up their home to us, and we were able to have a place to be because we were ready to leave. We were ready to leave the country, and I felt really uncertain and unstable about what came next. I found that on a daily basis, I noticed my anxiety was much higher. My sleep pattern was getting off. I wasn't going to bed at the same time each night, waking up at the same time each morning. I found just life seemed to grow into this large blur, and I felt really lost in it, very stuck in it. That that sense of stuckness it just feels like it becomes everything, and like we can't think straight. There was a sense of this fog that just settled over my mind, and it was hard to really cut through that. There were a handful of things that were incredibly helpful at that time. One of which was having another gracious voice nearby me, namely that of my wife, who encouraged me to go out on walks and to do things that were healthy and helpful. One of those practices that I started was a mindfulness practice, and I didn't know where to begin. So I just started with some names online I had heard about and tried things. I think the very first exercise I did asked me to focus on my left big toe for I was it 15 minutes, 20 minutes. I could tell you it was much longer than I'd ever thought of my toes before, and it was it was this really crazy experience that I didn't really see the benefit at the time, but it was something. And I found that practice, not specifically the toe practice, but mindfulness more generally, was something I could continue on and take with me. And I found a lot of health and stability. I found that I wasn't quite as stuck or lost in my thoughts and feelings as I had been before. And I felt a little bit better able to communicate them well. So it's just to say when I say this, yeah, this isn't just something that is important knowledge to have in our heads, but valuable to practice as well. Um, Especially for those who are counselors, therapists working in that realm. When you're working with other people, it can be very easy to get lost or stuck in their experience or your own, to get overwhelmed by the stressors. And this kind of practice, this kind of reflective practice I'm referring to as mindfulness, can be a really important basic skill so that you don't get stuck in your client, but so that you can still be open enough to your client that you're not lost in yourself. The next section, and we've already touched a little bit on this. I mentioned some of the values of mindfulness. It is effective in reducing stress, anxiety, depression. This is one of the reasons why so many have gravitated towards it. There are a number of electronic applications you can find with countless uh, sets of instructions on how to be a little bit more mindful. Uh, but I do want to draw attention to reasons why we might not recommend it to clients. I think, as I mentioned earlier, it isn't a silver bullet. It isn't just going to fix everything, and I think recognizing that is valuable for us all. Specifically, there are really two groups of clients that I often try to keep in mind um, that mindfulness might not be recommended. One group is for very young teenagers. As I mentioned earlier, there was a very large school-based mindfulness study that's involving 11 to 14-year-olds who showed little to no improvement in mental health just because they were taught mindfulness. And the research shows the reason why they didn't practice it. Uh, as simple as that might be, they didn't actually practice it. So in this case, it might not be recommended, not because it is going to hurt the client, but simply because the clients might not actually follow through. And in the end, we want to present stuff that they'll actually do. Secondly, it can be contraindicated for therapeutic reasons as well. In cases of complicated trauma, repressed PTSD symptoms can reemerge during mindfulness practices. Recognizing this is valuable. Just telling a client to go ahead and do mindfulness and then they go off and do it on their own is very likely putting them in a vulnerable position where they could get hurt. We can do harm. So part of protecting them, if you are going to use mindfulness responsibly with clients who are more vulnerable, do so with them so that you can, and make sure you spend a lot of time beforehand, building up their capacity to regulate their emotions, to manage what they can, give them the tools beforehand so that they're not being set up for failure. Also, clients who are vulnerable to bipolar disorders and psychotic disorders uh, also need to be cared for before engaging in mindfulness practices. A lot of work on stabilizing and grounding exercises and more basic reality testing work is necessary so that they don't get lost in the process. The last group that I would mention, if you find certain individuals who get really excited about meditation and mindfulness and all of a sudden want to do it for hours and hours and hours on end, that can also be a risk in some cases. It's not common, but there are groups who will go off and do mindfulness meditation retreats for 12 plus hours a day for many, many days on end. And in those cases, once again, those who are more vulnerable have experienced bouts of bipolar episodes as well as psychotic episodes. So in those more vulnerable populations, provide a lot of stabilizing and preparation. So those would be some that we need to be a little bit more concerned about. I wanted to get to the religious question behind it, because mindfulness meditation does come pretty directly out of Buddhist practice and history. People will point out that it's been used for 2,500 years. And there are a remarkable number of Buddhist scholars, practitioners, who have written extensively about the history thereof. There is a lot of background of mindfulness meditation in Buddhism. However, I would also note, I would want to emphasize the idea that mindfulness, as we've discussed it thus far, is a practice, an exercise that we can do to be a little bit more present and open to the truth of the world. That is something that does exist in Buddhism, but there are a number of other very similar practices in other parts, in other religions as well. And we could go through several, but I did want to draw attention to similar Christian practices. One of the most common that we see showing up in the first 1,000 to 1,500 years of Christianity was something referred to as watchfulness or wakefulness. This might not have been a common practice that we're used to from our own traditions, but it is one excellent example, primarily practiced in Eastern Orthodox monasticism, that focused heavily on people being alert, that we would be prepared for the ways that the devil or that Satan could be out to come at us. We need to discipline ourselves. And for those practicing this wakefulness in this sense, what was really, one author described it as a continual fixing and halting of thought at the entrance to the heart. That temptations don't start off as temptations. They start off as sensations, experiences, memories, wishes, dreams. There are all kinds of moment-to-moment experiences that arise in our mind. And they emphasize the importance of being attentive, on being present, on having a watchful mind that was ready to encounter what comes up in our mind, our thoughts, for example, with the truth, that we can come a little bit closer to emphasizing what the truth is. Although it's a bit ironic, the non-judgmental approach that I talked about earlier although it seems contradictory, is actually quite close to this, because the whole idea of being non-judgmental is that we want to be open to the reality as it is, as it presents. When we have a sensation, we are actually having that sensation. When I am in pain, I'm actually in pain. To say otherwise would be to deny the reality that's there. Similarly, if I have a negative thought, I had a negative thought. I might not like that it happened, but I didn't like the pain either. But if I just typically what we do is we just ignore it and go on. And while that works for a while, if the pain grows severe enough, it often means there's something else underneath that needs to be addressed. Something that, yeah, that needs to be managed. This approach is one focused on stillness. It's not about pouring all the right thoughts and ideas into our minds. It's not about trying to push ourselves out so that God can get in. It's about being present to ourselves so that we can recognize when God is there, so that we can be attentive to the ways that God is always already at work. I really like a quotation of Saint Benedict's when he says, "Make your ears so alert that the silence of God's presence sounds like thunder." This is the stance of prayer, one where we are coming to God not as that idealized version of me that I think God loves, but as me. As me. It's one of the reasons why I encourage when working with clients, introduce mindfulness. Yes, it has a lot of benefits, but I think if we can tie it to prayer, if we can tie it to action, if we can tie it to the larger practices that shape our Christian life, we're actually giving it a chance to do something. To put it differently, I don't want my clients to only manage their stress. I want them to live their life in a more healthy way so that their stressors are dealt with effectively. If I'm working with, for example, if I'm working with a couple where one spouse is just really frustrated and struggling to work through conflict with their partner, mindfulness exercises might be helpful for that spouse. But at the same time, if that's all we do, if all we do is keep on putting band-aids on and trying to make people feel better and don't actually give them the tools or the space to address the need that's there, to turn that watchfulness into action, into prayer, then we do them a disservice. I have just a few examples of how we as Christians might try to understand mindfulness. And these are simple models that we can present to individuals. For example, for clients who really for whom it might feel very abstract and airy and uncertain, I would really emphasize that third option, that what we're really talking about is encountering reality with more honesty and integrity. There are many pieces to who we are, and our sensations are part of our experience. So are our relationships. So are our thoughts and emotions, memories, dreams, attitudes. All of these things are part of our experience, but none of them are the whole thing. This is one of the reasons why I really try to emphasize that idea of integrity. We are integrating, we are drawing together the fractured pieces of who we are. And rather than living in kind of the illusory world of ideals of the person we wish we were, this allows us to actually rest in the body in the mind, in the relationships that God has given us. I mentioned earlier for clients who are younger, and maybe for whom a lot of this just seems really hard, I tend to focus on the attention as a muscle explanation because that's something that can make sense to them. It kind of makes sense that that they're struggling to pay attention when their mom asks them to do something, or when their teacher tells them to look over here or to work on this. And so I point out to them, yeah, your attention is a muscle, and you can find it moving in all kinds of different directions. So practicing it actually allows you to be a lot more present here. I remember interacting with one gentleman who had been practicing a form of mindfulness for decades, and he actually made the claim, whether I believe it or not is otherwise, but he made the claim that he had lost the ability to get bored, precisely because it had just become such a natural orientation that he just was present, and it was kind of hard for him to remember what it was like to be bored. For myself, I think the larger principle of never less, always more has been a go-to phrase. It's been my way of pointing out, yes, there are these different pieces of our experience, but none of them are the whole picture. And in fact, even if you tried to be mindfully aware of everything going on in your body and your mind and the world around you, even if you were incredible at that, you still wouldn't experience the whole of who you are, because there's more. There's always more. You're not done. None of us are. We keep on growing and stretching. We're never less than this moment, but we're always more. So what does this look like? What does the steps towards a Christian mindfulness look like? And these words really revolve around ideas like stillness or silence, meditation, contemplation, and prayer. To this end, I would want to emphasize that contemplation, being just one example, is not mindfulness. Stillness is not mindfulness. None of these things are mindfulness. However, being more mindful, being more present to who we are, actually expands and strengthens our capacity to be still. It gives us the clarity and focus to meditate. It allows us to hold the space for God to show up, which is what we see in contemplation. We're not manufacturing anything. We can't make God do anything. I've told clients before, when they come into the room, my model for healing is deeply rooted in the idea that God is always already at work. I don't have to kickstart him. I don't have to conjure him up in some way, or to say, give them magic words so their marriage is just perfect anymore. Far from it. God is always already there, even if I don't see it, especially perhaps when I don't see it, and when they don't see it. Coming into this space means trying to be still, precisely so that we can recognize when God is present. When God's present, when that silence of God's presence sounds like thunder. But a key element here is, I think, often one of, well, I'll talk about that here in a moment. I'll just give a quick summary, which is that mindfulness is a reminder that we don't have to be stuck or lost in where we're at. But I think one of the pieces that gets us there, there's a line from the poet T.S. Eliot, you are the music while the music lasts. You yourself are what God created and loved. You, in all of your complexity, in all of your challenges, in all of your lostness or your struggle, you are the one God loves. This can be, I think, hard sometimes for some. I think for Christians, because we're uncomfortable with the idea of self-focus. We're uncomfortable with the idea that we need to draw more attention to what's going on inside, especially when these are things we don't like, especially when these are painful things. We kind of come away with the attitude or perception that Christians are the ones who have it all together, right? That those are the people that God loves. Those are the ones. That's who I need to be like. When we don't recognize, when we do this, we're not actually touching the created reality that God made us to be. He always was so much closer than we will ever know. This is one of the reasons why I even use that phrase, always already, as a way of reminding us that God was there beforehand, and his love wasn't just something that comes after we accomplish certain tasks, after we pull all the pieces together. It's there in the pieces, there in the struggle, in the uncertainty and instability. Mindfulness is a practice. It's not the same thing as prayer in all of its multiple forms. But I think it's a call to our prayer, a call to come, to return to silence. Often, I don't think this is distinctively Christian or necessarily Western, but I do think we have a tendency to look for tools, for techniques. Give me something that will accomplish a goal. I want to get this done, so I need this. Which is, in many ways, the precise opposite of contemplation, of coming to a place where we're just taking joy in the present, where we are just here. It allows us to be a little bit more honest in our embodied, in our socially embedded selves. We are more than any one piece. We're never less, but we're always more. And I think this expression for me came to life with a line I remember from a second century theologian who said, "The glory of God is the human person fully alive, and the glory of the human person is the beholding of God." Let's all behold ourselves, each other, God, a little bit more. To that end, for those wanting to deepen this, to go further, to go a little bit farther in some way, because there's a lot of directions to do it. I've started by pulling together a handful of books, and I emphasize handful because when putting together a bibliography, I realized very quickly this would run on for pages and pages. And so I just wanted to introduce you to a very small selection of books on this topic that I think are valuable and worth the energy and attention. The first is by Daniel Siegel. I offered a quotation by him earlier in the presentation. I found that he does a very good job drawing together, integrating the work on mindfulness from multiple different perspectives. He is a neuropsychiatrist and has done a lot of work in research, but he is also a clinician and works with patients directly. In addition, his interest in this topic has led him to give presentations on science and on the science of mindfulness and mindful awareness at a variety of conferences for religious groups as well. The second suggestion, because sometimes people are we're not really looking for instruction on mindfulness, or all of that sounds too scientific and just too secular maybe, and we're really looking for a way to see how we can deepen this distinctly in a Christian context. For this, one book that I often recommend is Into the Silent Land, The Practice of Contemplation. Martin Laird is a beautiful writer. He draws this out well, and you'll find him connecting this to other practices. I only offered one earlier, wakefulness or watchfulness, but the Christian tradition has also incorporated mindfulness-oriented practices into things like, into things like centering prayer, which asks you to draw your attention to a single word or idea or thought or sensation, and to draw and to use that as part of how you are drawn into prayer with God. Right here, right now, the practice of Christian mindfulness was actually something a book I had not read until our director Lisa here had introduced us to it, and it provides an excellent background on mindfulness, specifically from the context of Christian history. I think that portion of it was the part I found most valuable into it, and I would definitely recommend it for clients who are looking to dig into it that way. For clinicians, Deborah Burdick's books on mindfulness skills, her workbooks, are very valuable and offer you more exercises than you'll ever need, certainly. And then for a more distinctive approach to Christian meditation, Joshua Knabb has a very nice book describing a four-step model for meditation that is distinctively Christian. Once again, while mindfulness is part of the story, it's not the whole thing. Finally, I offer probably my favorite book on the list, Silence, A User's Manual. In a world where we are surrounded by noise, where we are finding ourselves overwhelmed, I do think the recovery of silence is important. Sometimes we are purposefully looking for the noise to drown out or to manage the noise we feel inside, but just aren't ready to encounter. And while that's okay, I think there's more that we can find. My mind goes back a few years to a part of my pastoral program, or my pastoral counseling program, where a professor once asked me if I were to go over to someone's home who had just lost a loved one, and their family was there, what would my first inclination be? And ironically enough, I had to admit, I think my first inclination is to go to the kitchen to see if I can help with something. And not that is a strength of mine by any means, but it was just this momentary realization that I felt that need to do something to, and as I reflected in that conversation, I realized um, that part of it was a discomfort with silence that I was bringing with me. Because if we are not ready to sit with our own silence, we won't be able to sit with others. And so often that gift is something that we all sorely need because we are in this together. Thank you all. I appreciate it. And coming to the end, I want to make sure that we leave time for Q&A because, as I said, there's so much information on this, and I wasn't looking to, just deluge anyone with content. So, yeah, if there's any other information or context or content that I can offer, I would love to do so. So if you would type your questions into the chat to Lisa or I, we'll do our best here to yeah, try to speak to them.
All right, I'm sure you guys are preparing and maybe jotting down questions or starting to. As those start to roll in, I wonder if one of the top questions that people might have, and so I'll just pose it now to start with to get us kind of rolling for you, Nick, is you mentioned the place you started, which was to concentrate on your left toe. That was the exercise you started with, and whether you found that particularly helpful or not, I don't know, but I wonder for people that are maybe just starting out, or they're looking for a kind of a simple first practice. We did the breathing exercise. Is that where you'd recommend people starting, or is there another kind of go-to exercise that you recommend starting with?
Yeah, I think in general, the breathing exercise can be a really good place to begin. However, it can feel like a lot for some clients. And so I would probably say to focus on sensations first. Generally, when we try to use mindfulness exercises to examine our mental activities, it can feel overwhelming. We feel lost in them. It feels like too much. So starting with something highly concrete and specific is definitely something that I would recommend. I do this with breath with my clients in session. But I will also use pieces of an exercise that we actually have a website for on the Olive Tree Counseling website called the Wheel of Awareness. One piece of that practice is just going through your five senses, just spending a moment opening to whatever that sense is experiencing. And so this is often something that I'll do to start off clients who don't need a big, complex, complicated experience. Often the simpler, the better. And so I'll just start with one sense and sit with it and talk about what that was like. If you do try that, I would say not the sense of sight, only because we're very good at looking at things. We're less good at allowing our eyes to relax enough to just kind of be open to whatever is coming in. So often when going through the senses, I'll actually have clients close their eyes and then direct their attention to their sense of sight. So you're only catching what little light is coming through your eyelids, but it's a very different way of attending to that sense than we're used to.
Yeah, great. Another question here, and this kind of relates, I think, maybe into getting started in the practices or having a guide in the practice. Somebody asked if you have any thoughts on the Headspace app or what other practice resources might you recommend? I know there's the workbooks I think are good for that, but maybe aside from
Yeah.
books, apps, or otherwise that you
Oh,
might recommend for practice.
yes. Yeah, absolutely. There are a wide variety out there. Headspace is one that I used for a time a while back. I think there's one called, what's it, Insight? Oh, I'm forgetting the name all of a sudden. I apologize. Um, ah, yeah, Insight Timer was the name, and that's another one that I've used in the past and has a wide variety. You'll find some. Frankly, there are just so many recordings of people kind of leading folks through mindfulness exercises that you can even find ones on YouTube that are beneficial as well. One of the big values to the apps, though, is that it can help you keep track of how often you do it. Because one of the biggest obstacles to practicing mindfulness, at least it was for me, was consistency, was doing it regularly. And I think one of the benefits when I began was precisely that in the midst of that 2020 mess, that mindfulness practice was one of the most stable things about my daily routine. And so I do think it can be a powerful thing, but any kind of extra resource you can help you to use it regularly is valuable.
Mhm. Yeah, great. Somebody else asked about, you mentioned mindfulness practices based on research is not necessarily for kids because of the practice part. Um,
Yeah.
and asked, have you practiced mindfulness with any in your experience, and how young would you recommend? So yeah, just address the idea of working with kids, maybe somebody's own children or outside of the family.
Yeah.
How do you recommend trying that if you can?
Yeah, I think it would very much depend on the age of the child, of course, and developmentally where they are. Um, I I think one of the best. So there are a couple different pieces here, but one is when you are interacting with your child, try to what do I say? To be interested in what they're noticing. I think sometimes, uh, you know, parents in trying to attend to what their kids are noticing are trying to make sure they're not going to hurt themselves or do something bad or kind of get themselves into trouble. And so it can be a very good bad kind of experience. Just allowing them to notice what they notice. There are moments when they're sad, and I think our inclination, very rightly, is to soothe them, to make them feel better. But it's also okay for them to just be sad. And so, another way of saying this is, I think the most beneficial way you can interact with the child is having worked through whatever you're carrying with you. Because if you are ready to be open and present to them, they are going to sense that and feel that much more able to be present with themselves and others. That would be so for children who are old enough to talk about it. Um, for teenagers, it's a little bit different because they might not be as comfortable sharing openly, and in fact might go out of their way not to. Um, and so within that, recognizing that it's difficult, I would just say look for ways to interact mindfully with them. um, you are modeling for them in those years as much as anything. You are giving them a template or example for how to interact with the world well.
Mm.
um, and yeah, I, I think that's a good place to begin. Or I guess I one other thought. I really think mindfulness can be a beautiful thing with kids. Um, but once again, the place to begin is often with the body. It is their with their embodied experience, and so allowing, yeah, allowing that play to happen can be valuable. So I saw one recommendation once to play games with kids where you're pretending to be animals, where they are actually using their bodies in that way to pretend what it would be like. At that moment, they're interested, they're curious, they're exploring what it feels like to be in their body in this way and to try out something new. Uh, Looking for ways to engage with them in that, even doing it with them can be humbling to be sure, but it can be a lot of fun, and to let them know that they're okay.
I mean, I think that that's a practice adults could try as well, and find their way
Yeah,
into their body. A regular part of my mindfulness practice is pretending I'm a tiger, so it's good for everybody. Good. That should be though.
absolutely.
I might add it in though. That's a good kind of thought.
Yeah, I did a related skill. Now, this isn't mindfulness specifically, but with some of my nieces, where they were getting really bored at the end of church, and I just didn't know what to do and felt sluggish, and so we started doing silly walks where we would practice walking in increasingly silly ways, and we did that to get really, really, really silly, and then we kind of backed off, get less and less silly by the end. And it's a fun way for them to be able to engage this emotion in an embodied way, and a way that I was trying to let them know is okay. They're allowed to feel that way and even to work through it.
Mm,
Um,
fun practice. Next question queued up here. Somebody asked, are there places in scripture that you have found to be safe or familiar foundations on which to base mindfulness practices on for Christians who may be wary of mindfulness? So I think where in scripture do you go to support the idea of mindfulness practices for those that might be a little bit skeptical or wary of it being a Christian practice?
Oh, precisely. Yeah. So I would often start with the very practices that we've talked about. So, like, I mean, something as simple as be still and know that I am God. What does it mean to be still? What does that look like? Often, I think people recognize pretty naturally and quickly that's not only referring to physical stillness.
Mm,
It is hard to be physically still, but that's not clearly not enough. There's something about being still that makes space to recognize God being at work. Um, so I think that's one very, very easy go-to, and practices relate, a lot of passages relating to prayer can do it as well. But I think my mind right now keeps on going to Paul's letter to the Galatians, um, uh, to a set of verses that we talk about quite often, which is the fruit of the spirit. I find that I think that when well, at least I'll say when I first encountered that, I think I got the impression that the fruit of the spirit was a list of more commands that I was supposed to follow. And I think it was until growing up and becoming a Christian and recognizing, wait a minute, these are also words that are used to describe God and who He is. And this is saying it's the fruit of the spirit, and we're talking about the spirit living in us. And so taking that seriously, I think gives room to recognize God being at work within us in a very deep way. That when we are loving someone, God is loving that person. When we are taking joy in something, God is taking joy. That He is present within that space. And I think for the mindfulness practice, the reason why I think this is valuable is that it gives us permission uh, from God to be that, to take joy in being joyful. It's not a selfish thing or a guilty thing. This is just part of being there. Um, uh, I I think, yeah. So those are two passages that quickly come to mind. There are many more, especially in the Psalms, Um, but I find that the practice of mindfulness as kind of just being open and honest is not something that I see commanded in scripture as much as I see it demonstrated in scripture. I see it being exemplified in the kind of innocence and openness that we find through the Psalms, where you know David is saying something in prayer that we would never feel comfortable saying openly in prayer. There's a radical honesty and acceptance there that is willing to accept not only the good, but also the bad as part of our lived experience. And ultimately, I I see it worked out uh, most fully in that command that we love God with all of our heart, mind, strength, soul. I don't, as I kind of explained in a newsletter a while back, I don't see that as there being these are the pieces of us, and we need to love God differently through each of them. I see it very much as their way of saying, love God with every part of who you are. And if what I'm what I suggested earlier what was accurate, we don't even recognize all of who we are because we're still becoming. But we're still developing. I don't even know where it's all going to go yet. There are all these different aspects of ourselves. And so being able to love God with all of that means having an open hand because there's more to the story. And we're never less, always more.
Good word. Next question. Wondering about, so you talked about the roots of Buddhism, mindfulness, and Buddhist practices, and wonder if there's any parts of kind of mindfulness practices that are out there, perhaps in the Buddhist tradition or just kind of otherwise, that you would steer away from or feel like would be harmful or don't kind of line up with the idea of mindfulness, Christian mindfulness. Is there any part of it that you would say this doesn't line up very well, or you could stay kind of clear of that? That makes sense.
Absolutely. So the Buddhist practice of mindfulness is very much tied to certain Buddhist doctrines, and in particular, the belief that all beings are impermanent. Within Buddhism, there's a strong sense of impermanence. And part of how that connects with the experience of mindfulness is that when we observe our sensations, when I'm observing my thoughts, they change. They come, they go, they rise, they fall, they get stronger, they get weaker. There is a sense of impermanence and change to it that was very, very firmly fixed. And within the Buddhist practice, they would actually kind of push that as far as to say that there really is no I, there is no self, there is no permanent being that is just always the same. Now, to some degree, we recognize this too. We aren't permanent. We aren't firmly fixed in that way. But as Christians, there is a belief in the solidity, the stability of God. That there is this deeper and firm foundation in God that we rest in. And so while I do think there is a lot of value and just honesty in recognizing that impermanence, there is value in that. But especially when the practice is pushed to question whether I am a coherent I, whether the self exists. Well, I'll speak first as a counselor. I would say, and say that can be a very vulnerable place for some people to go. And I have read stories of individuals practicing that style of meditation, which is beyond mindfulness. But in so doing, who ended up with severe mental disorders that they had to work through for some time. So I would say, from a counseling perspective, there are depths when it frankly just can be dangerous. From a Christian perspective, I think while it can be valuable to remember and recognize our own impermanence, our death. For Christians, we ultimately are grounded in the life we find in God, in Christ, and recognize that it's bigger than us. Of course it is, but that doesn't mean that it's untrustworthy or unstable. Far from it. We're part of something bigger.
Yeah. That's great. I think we'll wrap up from here. I think we could think about or talk about this topic for a long time, but that's enough to digest in this instance. I think I really appreciate, Nick, your time and your expertise in sharing that with us. For those of you that are listening and still with us, this is presentation will be up on the website within a few days and on YouTube, along with Nick's slides and that bibliography he shared. So if you want to look back at certain points or re-listen or share it with friends or family or people in your organization, you're welcome to do that. It'll be on our website on the webinars page within a few days. Thanks to Nick's wife, actually. She's our web guru. So thanks again, Nick. Appreciate you and everybody that's attended, also you, and we'll see you next time.